Thank you very much, Carlos, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Mary, for the invitation to speak to this group of people. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for making time for this presentation. I will share with you a screen. Let's see if this is successful. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the plan of action is to give you an insight based on recent research that I have been doing with co-author Alan Ise on Latin American growth. Now, as you can all understand from your classes and the conversations at the center, growth is an important dimension of social and economic development. It's not the only one. And depending on your worldview and set of ethical values and other principles, it may not even be the most important dimension of economic development. In my opinion, it's up there. There are other dimensions to economic development, including stability, political and economic, social equity, environmental sustainability. So those dimensions of development are important in their own right, and they cannot be reduced to growth. But growth is an important one and can interact in virtuous circles or in vicious circles with the other dimensions of development. So just an important caveat, no, development is multidimensional. Growth is one dimension, not the only one, but an important one. And so in this lecture, what I want is to walk you through the Latin American growth conundrum. Conundrum in the sense that Latin America has had a very hard time finding its path to growing. Growth has been elusive for the region. And some people think that Latin America is characterized by three major traits. It's a low growth region, it's an unstable region, and it's an unequal region. So that creates a complexity in a region that is otherwise wonderful and most appealing in many respects, including in its cultural history and cultural assets and natural assets. So let's get to the topic. For those who are interested in reading more about this topic, I recommend particularly the last two citations here. One is a chapter I wrote with Alan Ise for a book that was just published by CAF, which is a development bank for Latin America. And it's a book published on the 50 years of the foundation of CAF. So in that chapter, we reviewed 50 years of economic development in Latin America. And in that chapter, we do cover dimensions that are not only related to growth. In particular, we look at the issues of macroeconomic stability and social equity. And it gives, I think, a useful, it's turning out to be a useful tool for teaching, because it provides a coherent history of economic development in the last 50 years in Latin America. So that's the second citation here. And the third one is an article that's just appearing in Economia, which is the Latin American Economic Association's journal, which is a little more technical and goes into more of the technical details of some of the messages I want to convey in this lecture on growth. But let's start with some facts and puzzles on growth. This is one way to put growth in Latin American context. What you see in this graph is the income per capita of a region divided by the income per capita of the US. So in some sense, it measures the distance in the economic development or well-being of a country as proxied by GDP per capita of a country or a region relative to the US. And it shows you 100 years of history. And what you have here is Latin America is in the orange line. Southern Europe, meaning Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, is in the blue line. Southeast Asia, including the tigers, green line, and Sub-Saharan Africa in the brown line. So the story can be told in 4 acts if you look at it this way. Before the Second War, Latin America had a level of development and standard of living, if you want, comparable to that of Southern Europe. You see Latin America and Southern Europe being about 40% of the US per capita income and keeping their position, and then including converging towards the US per capita income before the big Second War. And then, of course, everything went down, including the US, the advanced economies, but Latin America and Southern Europe took a nosedive. So until 1935, let's say, Latin America was comparable to Spain or Italy or Portugal in terms of economic development. And the divergence, the loss of ground of the region really begins after the 50s. And here you see Latin America losing ground in its per capita income relative to the US in a very consistent manner, with a very significant dip in the 80s, the so-called lost decade of Latin America. And then rebounding, although just temporarily, because now we're going down again during the China surge. So you can see that in the post-World War era, Latin America essentially went through kind of 3 big stages. The stage of import substitution, where Latin America chose to look inward and to pursue a development effort based on producing products that would substitute for imports. And it was more of a inward-looking growth pattern. Then you had a period where this experiment did not do that well, and it exhausted, and Latin America entered a very important bad period of the lost decade in the 80s, where most of the region had crises and debt defaults, etc. In the 90s, Latin America stabilizes, a painful stabilization effort, gets a little bit back of its growth, and then it has the crisis of the late 90s, where it loses ground again, and then China pulls the region out together with the rest of the world, because China became the big engine of global growth starting in the 2000s. And you can see how Latin America loses ground relative to Southern Europe. Southern Europe is now much higher standard of living than Latin America, almost twice as much. And then somewhere in the 80s, Southeast Asia takes over, and now Southeast Asia is a more developed region compared to Latin America. So this is a rather sad history of growth performance for Latin America. One message I want to give you from this graph is that one way to interpret this history is to say, okay, let's look at the regions that did well after the Second War. And you have Southern Europe and you have Southeast Asia really growing at a formidable pace. One way to interpret that is to think, okay, which were the big growth engines after the Second War? And the world really had 3 growth engines. The US, which comes roaring after the Second War with all sorts of becoming the most important economy in the planet, and it's lifting, and it's growing very fast, lifting the world with it. So the US is the most important growth engine, but also Western Europe. The Marshall Plan helped Germany and France to rebuild. They regained growth and productivity. And so Germany particularly became a second engine of growth. And then there was Japan. Japan also reconstructs after the Second War and becomes a global engine of growth. And so one way to interpret this graph is that Southern European countries latch onto Germany, and through Germany with the growth engines of the world, and they get pulled out of their low standard of living, and they converge towards the US standards of living very, very pronouncedly. So they grab onto an engine of growth, which is Western Europe. Asia, in turn, latches onto Japan. And through Japan, it connects with the growth poles in the world, and they display a fantastic growth path that has raised their income per capita above that of the Latin America. In Latin America, in some sense, misses the train, because precisely after the Second War, it does not find a way to benefit from connecting itself to the US, which was the most obvious growth engine. Instead, Latin America, for intellectual reasons as much as for practical and historical reasons, decides to rather go into an inward-looking growth strategy. In those days, Latin America develops a very important intellectual paradigm about dependency theory and structuralism, and the messages out of those views were you better not rely on the US, try to avoid relying on commodities, and try to develop your own manufacturing sector. Even if you have to protect it, let's do it, because that will guarantee growth in the future. So that's the grand experiment that Latin America enters, probably at the worst time, because in that sense, Latin America missed the train to growth, which in those days were growth through exports. That's what happened in Southern Europe and in Southeast Asia. And we will talk a little bit more about that, but that's a message of this graph. Second point about growth in Latin America is that growth in Latin America, unlike other regions, has not been dominated by productivity growth. We economists like to think, based on the theories of Solow and Swan and those great economists, that growth can be largely explained by how productive your economy is and how fast productivity grows. The famous Solow residual that measures productivity, kind of that mystery. So long-term growth tends to be thought of by economists as driven by productivity growth. But if it was productivity growth doesn't fluctuate as much as growth in Latin America has fluctuated. That's the black line here. So what I did with my co-author here is we created a control group, or a comparison group, a peer group for Latin America, and composed of the countries in the red bars that have similar per capita incomes to the Latin American basket of countries, if you want. So in some of the exercise I will show, we show growth patterns in Latin America and compare to those of the control group, which are the countries in the red bars. So the control group, this is the growth in the control group. And you see, growth is cyclical. It has cycles, as is normal with market economies. But the cycles are much less pronounced for the control group than it is for Latin America. Latin America has huge fluctuations in economic growth. And here you have the three big cycles, the cycle that's driven by the import substitution period, and then the big debt crisis. Another cycle in the 90s, Latin America wakes up and then ends up and then the cycle of China, again, going up and down. These fluctuations in growth in Latin America, this volatility in growth is very much a Latin American trait. And when you compare it to the control group, you see that Latin America has great fluctuations. And those fluctuations are not driven by productivity. They are driven by aggregate demand factors, which you can see here when you compare inflation in Latin America. That's the solid, the real exchange rate in Latin America, the solid black line. Inflation in Latin America, the black dotted line, compared to the corresponding variables for the control group. What you see is Latin America has had much bigger fluctuations in the real exchange rate, owing to fluctuations in spending. So Latin America is a region that goes through bouts of spending, overspending, contraction, overspending, contraction. That is a bit, and you see that in the big fluctuations in the real exchange rate and also in inflation. Even in this last period where Latin America has managed to have a low inflation similar to the control group, it has had a much more pronounced appreciation and then depreciation of the real exchange rate, which is a reflection that cannot be productivity. It has to be some sort of cyclical demand patterns. So for Latin America, the fluctuations have mattered more in demand than they have for the control group. Another fact that I want to emphasize, because I'll come back to this later on, is that Latin America used to be, economically speaking, you could talk about Latin America as a region from the economic point of view until the mid-80s. Because until the mid-80s, Latin American countries had a very similar trade structure. You see it in these graphs. In this graph, what you have is the relevance of natural resource exports, commodities in total exports, the relevance of manufacturing exports in total exports, and the relevance of services, such as tourism, in total exports. And you can see how the region is now 3 regions from the economic point of view. From the belt up, that is from Panama up, or Northern Colombia up, what you have is South America. In South America, as you can see here in the gray line, before the mid-80s, you could see that the proportion of commodities in total exports was similar all throughout the region. Everybody in Latin America, every country in Latin America was some sort of an commodity exporter. But the realities they bifurcate. South America remains a major commodity exporter. About 70% of its exports are commodities. Whereas Central America becomes less and less dependent on commodities, and so does Mexico. So you have 3 realities here. South America remains as a commodity producer, a commodity exporter, and its trade structure looks like that. When it comes to manufacturers, you see all of the countries had similar relevance of manufacturers in total exports until the mid-80s. After the mid-80s, what happens is that Mexico becomes a major manufacturing exporter, major. And now about 80% of its exports are manufacturers. Whereas South America, gray line, and Central America have much less development of manufacturing exports in their export basket. And so Mexico is a manufacturing exporter now. And then for services, what you see is that while all Latin American countries had similar participation of services in total exports, it is Central America that becomes much more of a service exporter. Not only tourism, you have in Panama all sorts of services, accounting, finance, legal services, transshipment, etc. Even medical services in countries like Costa Rica, etc. So you have a fast growth in services in Central America, whereas in Mexico, services decline as a share of total exports, and in South America, they remain more or less constant. So we have 3 big realities from the economic point of view in terms of trade structure. South America, commodity exporter, a commodity exporting sub-region. Mexico, a manufacturing exporter linked to the US market. And Central America, a services exporter, also linked largely to North America. Those are the facts. 4 growth puzzles I would like to raise in the rest of the presentation. First one, the import substitution industrialization puzzle. The puzzle can be stated as well as follows. Most Latin American countries chose that growth path in the 60s, 70s, until the beginning of the 80s. Why only few countries did well and others did not do that well? There's a big debate among economists as to why, whether import substitution industrialization worked, didn't work, why didn't work, and whether import substitution industrialization planted the seeds of its own demise. I have another paper where we argue with my co-authors that import substitution industrialization did plant the seeds of its own demise, but that's a debatable point. I mean, Jose Antonio Campo, for instance, we think says that the import substitution industrialization was fine, and it was going in the right direction, and it would have made us an industrial economist had we let it go, but it was other factors outside of import substitution industrialization which debilitated that model. So there's that debate. But the question here is, why did some countries do well and others didn't? The second major puzzle, and this drives the Mexicans crazy, is that Mexico turns to manufacturing exports. So Mexico pulls an Asia on us. They successfully switch their entire economy to be outward oriented and led by manufacturing exports. So very successful in that regard, and yet it doesn't grow. Why? Second puzzle. Third puzzle, South America remains very dependent on commodities, and as all of you know, commodities can become a curse. If you become too dependent on commodities, and that damages your institutions and your economic structure, you may actually be affected by negative growth or contraction. And a good example of that is Venezuela. Venezuela was doing well with oil until it just has gone against the cliffs. And so Venezuela is a good example where oil has become a curse. Rather than helping growth, it has undercut growth. But in South America, the question is, why have some countries avoided the curse? The two main examples that come to mind are Chile and Peru, who have remained very strong commodity exporters and have done relatively well in terms of growth. And then you have the Central American puzzle. All Central American countries switched to services export, as I showed you before. They are major services exporters, and yet only few of them, mainly Panama, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic, which I include in this sample, have done well in terms of growth, where the others, namely El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and to some extent also Nicaragua, have done very poorly. So the puzzles are why countries choose a common path, and yet some do well and some others do not. And in the rest of the presentation, I will try to shed some light into these puzzles. Of course, you can have a full semester on exploring these puzzles and looking at various views, but I'm going to give you throw some light into these puzzles using a recent research that we have been doing. The point of entry for the research is I take a cue from this type of graph. What this type of graph shows me is that if you take all of the countries in the world and you plot and you look at 60 years of growth, and you plot you create these scatters where in one axis you put the rate of change in the share of exports that the country has in total exports. So if a country gains participation in global exports, you move up in the positive direction in the vertical axis. If a country loses presence in international markets of exports, you go south in this axis. And on this axis, what we graph is whether the GDP per capita of that country is either getting closer to that of the US or going away from that of the US. So if you are right of this vertical line, these would be countries whose GDP per capita has been over this period, 60 to 2000, getting closer, approaching that GDP per capita of the US. So of course you would like to be to the right of this vertical line because you want your economy to, as we economists say, to converge towards the standards of living of the advanced economies. In this case, I chose the US as that. And so what you have is that there is a very strong association. The countries that do better in raising their presence in export markets, that raise their participation in exports, therefore that are north of the horizontal line, are countries that also tend to do better and move their standard of living towards that of towards that of the US. So you want to be in this quadrant, in the northeast quadrant, where you is a bunch of countries that have come closer to the US. South Korea is a champion here, and has done so on the strength of becoming more relevant in the global export markets. These are the majority of countries in the planet. Most countries in the planet diverged during 60 to 2000, diverged away from the US. The US actually gained ground in terms of per capita income relative to those countries, so they lost ground there. And they also lost ground in terms of their share in global exports. So you can see a very strong association. You are not going to converge to the US per capita income if your exports are not gaining presence in global markets. So this is the message of this. There seems to be a strong association in finding your place in international trade and growing. And it is what this meant. It says that on average, if you don't have dynamic exports, it's going to be very hard for you to grow. That's the message of this graph. I did the same graph for 2000 to 2016 to acknowledge that there's a structural break when China erupts into the world. And what you see, that China effect is amazing. China lifted a lot of the low income and medium income countries, and you have a very large number of countries here that shifted to the north east quadrant. That is, many countries grew faster, their per capita income grew faster than that of the US, so they converged. They're to the right of the vertical axis. And they also gained participation in global exports, partly because they sold things to China. And so China is at the helm here, and a big shift of convergence. What's interesting about this graph is this graph explains a lot of current politics. The emerging markets did very well under China under the last 2,000 years, but the rich countries have done poorly. And so part of the global tensions, what you see in politics, has to do with the fact that the advanced economies got used to doing very well in the 1960 to 2000 period, but in 2000 to 2016, they actually lost ground relative to the emerging markets, and the emerging markets gained ground relative to the advanced economies in a very dramatic way, and it could be attributed to the dynamics that China introduced into the global economy. So taking this idea, what we did with my co-author, saying, okay, we need to try to look at Latin American growth from the point of view of trade, and also from the point of view of macro, because these fluctuations in growth in Latin America seem to be part of Latin American history. So we need a way to approach growth that takes into account aggregate demand fluctuations, cycles, and volatility, and trade, because they seem to be important to tell the story of Latin American growth. So we did that with a simple equation, which for those of you who know algebra can follow me now, and the other ones just can close your ears and wait a little bit, and you don't miss too much if you don't get this one. But it's a simple equation which essentially decomposes the growth of a country relative to the growth of the world. So everything is expressed as growth, the rate of growth of a country relative to the rate of growth of the world. And that can be decomposed into three components. The first one is how much the exports of that country grow relative to the exports of the world, which is how much you gain or get behind in your export. And this term we call the export pool when you put it in logarithmic terms. So one factor determining growth is the export pool. How well are you doing in terms of your exports and the presence you gain in international markets through your exports? The second term is the current account, the variations in the current account, because it's the growth of the imports of the country relative to the growth of the exports of the country. So when this term goes up, it's because the country is importing, its imports are growing faster than its exports, and therefore the external current account is moving towards a deficit. But when you do that, when a country expands its external deficit, what's happening is that the country is using foreign savings, and it's either borrowing abroad or getting FDI from abroad. So this term we call the external leverage, how much you leverage on external resources, and we want to know whether that is connected to your growth or not. And the third term, which we call the domestic response, is simply the rate of growth of your GDP relative to the rate of growth of your imports, adjusted for the same variables for the world. And so what this term is telling you is this country managing to have its total economy growing faster than its imports? So this term goes up, and therefore is associated with higher growth if a country manages to have a domestic response whereby your GDP grows faster than imports. And this term we call the domestic response. So we decompose growth in these three terms: export pool, external leverage, and domestic response. We put it in logarithm terms, we create this little equation, and then we run the data. And we want to see how Latin America does when you look at growth through this angle, and when you try to answer the puzzles that I mentioned. First of all, I want to convince you that this is a good way of looking at growth in Latin America. It's not a good way of looking at growth for the Asian tigers. Because for the Asian tigers, you might as well use the solo approach and look at productivity. Because when you look at the external leverage, which is the dotted gray line here, and when you look at the domestic response, what you see is that they fluctuate around zero. So there's no action in those two terms of the equation. What drives growth for the Asian tigers is exports. And therefore, exports may be a good expression of productivity, and you may be able to use the machinery of solo to analyze growth in Asia, because aggregate demand fluctuations, which are represented by the external leverage, and domestic responses, which are partly demand and partly the ability of your economy to grow faster than imports, there's no action there. They hover around zero. So you could, this particular technique that I'm proposing would not be particularly insightful for Asia, but it is hugely insightful for Latin America, because Latin America, you see growth in the black line. Of course, it goes with exports, but the fluctuations in aggregate demand, the external leverage, and the domestic response move dramatically, and they tend to move in different directions. So when you have a boom, here's let's say a boom here. Let's take this one here. So when we are growing fast, we are running very large current account deficits because we're borrowing. Latin America is like that. No? We grow because we borrow until we can no longer borrow, but during the time in which we're borrowing, our imports our imports tend to grow faster than exports. So you see this here: borrowing a lot abroad, imports growing too fast relative to GDP. And so these fluctuations in these variables, in these components, are a big part of what happened with growth in Latin America. So this particular way of looking at growth is useful for Latin America. And when you look at the variance decomposition, in Asia, all of the variance of growth can be explained by exports. In Latin America, a lot of the variance of growth is explained, a lot of it is explained by the external leverage. This tendency of Latin America to go into spending binges, current account deficits, borrowing, followed by current account contractions and debt problems. When you compare it to the control group, you have the same story. In Latin America, you have the graph that I showed you before, where the domestic response and the external leverage fluctuate a lot with growth. And in the control group, there's much more stable domestic response, and the external leverage hovers around zero. So Latin America is quite unique in that it is impossible to understand growth history in Latin America if you don't take into account macro factors, which determine the volatility and domestic demand variations, and trade factors. So for the import substitution puzzle, here's the story. During import substitution, the countries that did well are these two: Brazil and Mexico. And that's why during the 60s, we used to talk about the Brazilian miracle. They were very strong, enthusiastic import substitutors. They closed their economy. They promoted the growth of their manufacturing activities to be sold in the domestic market. They did well. But Latin America as a whole didn't do that well. So that's part of the debate. Only a couple of countries did well. There are two other countries that did relatively well. One is Ecuador, which is in the blue line here. You have that boom in the 70s, and Ecuador does well under an import substitution growth pattern. And the other one that does relatively well is Colombia in this purple line. But if you look at Argentina, Argentina did very badly during import substitution. It kept on doing badly later on. So Argentina is kind of a lost cause in that regard. So why do some countries do well under import substitution and others did not? The common hypothesis out there, most economists would tell you, well, it was because when you grow inward, your domestic market matters a lot. And so if you're a large country, you have more economies of scale, a bigger domestic market. If your strategy to grow is to look inward, a large domestic market with a lot of economies of scale should be the driver. And it is true. You can say, yeah, maybe that's why Brazil and Mexico did so well. They are essentially very large domestic markets. And so if you try to grow based on your local economy and kind of look the other way to the world, that would be the trick. That, however, is only a partial explanation, because Argentina is also a large market, and yet it didn't do well. Ecuador and Colombia are rather small markets, and they do better, and they did better. So maybe there are other factors behind the success or failure of import substitution. And when we run this decomposition, and we divide Latin American countries into the high performers, which are Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico, and the low performers, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And you run this decomposition, they do this graph where you take the high performers minus the low performers. What you see is that really what separated the two groups of countries are the dynamism of their exports. The EP, the external pool, is the one that really differentiated the two groups of countries. So it may be that being a large economy was helpful to benefit from an inward-looking growth, but the main factor seems to have been whether you could export. And that's an important contradiction inside import substitution, because import substitution was predicated on the idea that the region will become free from the dependence on commodities. But to have an import substitution model, you need to import a lot, so you need foreign exchange. And so what seems to have determined how well you did on import substitution is whether you had enough foreign exchange to keep the model going. And since you were not interested in exporting manufacturers to competitive markets, and you were looking inward, you needed to rely more on commodities. And so import substitution industrialization, instead of breaking us free from the dependence on commodities, intensified that dependence. That's an important twist to the common story. Being large or small may matter, but it matters more whether you have a lot of revenues from commodity exports. And you could see that import substitution industrialization started losing steam once the exports of commodities was not sufficient to maintain the model, which was hungry in foreign exchange. To produce local manufacturers, you needed to import a lot. And in fact, industrialization in Latin America was a short-lived event. Here is Latin America in the orange, Southeast Asia in the green. And Latin America did increase the share of manufacturers in total exports and became industrialized. But after the mid-'80s, it deindustrialized very fast and lost the manufacturing industry, which was in the end a very inefficient industry. And so it could not compete in global markets. Latin America lost that during the 80s and 90s, whereas Southeast Asia continued to grow and of course has moved to more and more sophisticated manufacturers. And now Southeast Asia produces computer chips and artificial intelligence and motherboards for laptops, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at growth after import substitution, you can see the heterogeneity in the region. These are the sad countries. Venezuela, again, this is compared to the US per capita income. Venezuela lost ground like hell, both in the 90 to 2017 period, the long period, or a shorter period, 2000 to 2017. So Venezuela is the catastrophe in Latin America. And it's a sad story because in the 70s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America. But this is the puzzle, Mexico. Mexico is the second worst performer in the region since 1990 until the present, in spite of the fact that Mexico successfully shifted towards manufacturing exports. These countries in the middle are the mediocre ones, particularly these ones here, which include Argentina and Ecuador and Brazil. They didn't do that well. The rate of convergence to the US per capita income was below 1%. These did a little better, including Colombia, getting closer to the US per capita income at a rate of above 1% per year, but below 2%. And these are the really high performance in Latin America. Of course, you have Chile, which did very well, particularly in the 1990s. But you have also Peru. Panama is the star performer. is a country that is growing like an Asian country, and the income per capita in Panama is getting very, very fast closer to that of the US. But you also have Peru, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. So these are the countries. Remember these names, because if you want to see who is doing relatively well in terms of growth in Latin America and has been doing so for the last 30 years, these are the countries: Panama, Dominican Republic, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. The rest there's not much to write home about. So the second puzzle, Mexico. Why did Mexico's export orientation, manufacturing export orientation, why did it not pay growth dividends? Why did it not produce a miracle similar to that of Asia? Here's part of the answer. Here what we did is we compared trade openings, trade liberalization episodes around the world, and we got a bunch of them, like 40 cases. And we lined them up from the moment they started until 30 years later. And we did the same thing for Mexico. And what you see is a major contrast between the trade liberalization that Mexico underwent. Mexico needed to do trade liberalization in order to shift towards manufacturing exports. So it needed to open the trade regime, and it did so. So what you see, the pattern when you decompose into export pull and domestic response, the pattern in the world average is that the moment you liberalize and open your trade, you initially have a dip in growth because you get competition from imports. And the industries that you used to have that were producing goods that competed with imports may be displaced and may lose in the competitive scene. So you have a downturn in growth initially, and a big decline initially in the domestic response in the sense that imports grow faster than GDP. But then, as liberalization takes hold and the country continues its reforms, exports remain above those of the world. Growth picks up above that of the world, and the domestic response becomes stronger and stronger. In Mexico, you have a very different story, a major dropping after the liberalization, major drop in growth, an even bigger drop in the domestic response, and a very difficult path for the domestic response. Mexico, for some reason, cannot get traction from exports the way other countries have been able to do it. It has been able to get some traction in the latter years after the shock of China in the first decade of the 2000s towards 2010. Mexico started getting up a little bit here. But what explains, so one way to understand this is that Mexico had a very highly protected economy. When it liberalized, a lot of industries that were compete with imports were destroyed. So the high protection during the import substitution and industrialization meant a major destruction of the importable sector, the production of importables, much deeper and more lasting than in other countries, given the high protection. When Mexico starts getting exports up around here, it gets exports, but the value added of those exports are not that high. So when you look at the share of manufacturing exports in total exports, it goes up, but the share of manufacturing value added in total GDP doesn't go up as much, meaning Mexico goes into exporting, but with a content of value added that's not very high. Then it gets hit by China. Just when it's trying to wake up here, China hits it and sends it down again in this period. So China was a major hit that derailed Mexico's process for a while. And then what you see is that Mexico is extremely dependent in the US market, and the US, and it sells to the US market products that are not very elastic with income. So when income rises in the US, those Mexican products do not rise as fast. So several factors around it. The standard story as to why Mexico did not do well is a story that didn't do sufficient complementary reforms. And I think that's a correct story. And Mexico did not liberalized the trade structure, but didn't do sufficient complementary reforms. Therefore, it could not get traction, benefits from liberalization. But in addition to that, I think this story tells us also that high protection before liberalization was a problem for Mexico. The timing of China entering into the world was not good for Mexico, and its extreme dependence on the US market also constrains Mexico's ability to get dividends out of exports. When it comes to South America, if you look to the third puzzle, why some South American countries avoid a curse, we have two answers in the paper. One, the countries that do better are the ones that manage the commodity cycles better. So here is Latin America, South America on average, and what you see in the dotted line, the terms of trade, which is the price of exports divided by the price of imports. And what you see is Latin America has had significant cycles in commodity prices. And the last cycle is the most pronounced one with China, the big commodities boom. Here, prices of commodities going up, in terms of trade going up, and then tanking after 2012, 2013, more or less. But what's interesting is that the external leverage, which reflects how much spending flows out because through imports, spending binges. Latin America has had very large spending binges here and a very large spending binge here that consume more than what they get through better commodity prices. So South America has this tendency to, when it is blessed by a good prices of its commodities, it tends to go on a party and gets drunk and overspends, and then they have a bad, getting out of the drunkardness is difficult, and so the pains of adjustment afterwards. You see the same when you compare Argentina with New Zealand. They have very similar growth patterns, they're very similar trade structure, but what makes a difference between Argentina and New Zealand is Argentina has this very, very important tendency for spending to exceed income or to have to contract dramatically when things go bad. So the countries that do better in Latin America are those that manage the cycles better, and that's why Chile and Peru do better, because Chile and Peru manage the commodity cycles much better than, say, Ecuador, Venezuela, or Uruguay is another good, prudent manager of cycles. And the second explanation we see, and this as an illustration, you compare Chile and Peru, is that even if you are stuck with commodities and you have to export commodities and you have not been able to diversify, you can still grow as long as you can get your exports to continue to grow in volume terms. You see this is in the 90s until the present, Chile and Peru. Chile was doing very well in the 90s, and in the 90s, export volume in Chile was going up, and Chile was growing like a rocket, was going up. But then in the 90s, Chile starts slowing down, and it slows down because the volume of exports goes down, and with it, growth goes down. And then even though Chile goes into somewhat of a spending binge to try to support growth, it doesn't get growth to recover too much. So it is this secular downturn or secular decline in export volumes, which has been hurting Chile in the last years, and that's why growth in Chile has been falling. And Peru is the reverse. Peru has been able to keep export growth above the zero line, growing faster, and that has lifted growth in Peru above that of Chile. When you do A minus B, B minus A, what you see is that the difference, or A minus B, the difference is really that Chile's export growth in volume terms fell well below that of Peru, and that may be the main reason why it falls. So this is an additional explanation, which is a little hopeful. You may be stuck with commodities. That doesn't mean you cannot grow, as long as you don't count only on prices, as long as you get your commodity industry to continue to produce and your exports to continue to grow and gain presence in global markets. So even if you are not very sophisticated, or even if you don't have very complex exports, as Ricardo Hausmann would say, as long as you keep on gaining presence in global markets, you could still grow. And that's one way to avoid the curse. Finally, the Central America services puzzle. Which are the countries that did well and which are the countries that have not done well in Central America? Panama, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic are the high performers. El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are the poor performers. All of them have moved to a bigger share of services exports in total exports. This is South America, good performance and bad performance in South America. And you can see that the exports the share of services exports in total exports for Central America is very high. To the right are the good performers. To the left are the poor performers in Central America. These are Central America, 1990 and 2016. All of them export a lot of services. And the share of service in total exports has been growing in both countries. So the difference is not so much in exporting more or less services as a total of your exports. The difference is here. The high performers do not depend on remittances. This is Panama, Costa Rica, and Dominican Republic. They have a very low level of remittances income compared to the low performers. They survive with remittances. Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras live and die with remittances in some sense. The converse, the opposite of that, or the other side of the coin of that, is that the high performers have a lot of FDI, foreign direct investment, flowing into the country as a percent of GDP at much higher rates than the lower performers. So this is an interesting story. So what seems to happen in Central America is that if you don't do very well, it's because you depend on remittances. So you have to ask yourself, why do you depend on remittances? What's the meaning of that? Well, it means that your workers don't want to stay at home. It means that your workers try to cross the Rio Grande or try to go to Europe, and they bring their labor power to the countries to work with the capital, to the capital stock of richer countries. So these are cases where workers go to work with someone else's capital outside of the frontiers. The high performers are countries where FDI comes, meaning foreign capital comes to your country to work with the workers in your country, and the workers in your country don't have an incentive to leave. So that's a very important difference. FDI is very important in the high performance in Central America. Remittances is too much of a dependency for the poor performance in Central America. So remittances may be good to keep people alive, but they are not good for productivity and for growth. And so the reason you have to ask yourself, why do the high performers get much more foreign direct investment than the poor performers? And in the high performance, workers don't want to leave and they want to stay home, whereas in the poor performers, workers want to go abroad. Why is that? Here's one reason, not the only, but one reason. The governance and institutions and rule of law is much weaker in the poor performers. Here you have crime statistics. In El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, you have very high crime rates. In Costa Rica, Panama, Dominican Republic, much lower crime rates comparable to those in South America. So homicides and kidnapping are much lower. That suggests that the rule of law works better in the high performers. And when you look at the absence of corruption, the higher, the more the absence of corruption, the lower, the more corruption there is, the less the absence of corruption. High performers have a much better control of corruption, and much better police and justice system quality compared to the low performers. So behind the fact that in one case, workers want to go abroad to work in the US, in the other case, workers stay and capital comes to the country, may be largely explained by the fact that the rule of law conditions are very different in the two groups of countries. In the end, we live in a world where people who want to buy services from a country are unlikely to go to that country if the rule of law is weak. You go there and you are subject of a crime or of a theft or insecurity. So let me just finish quickly with some broad implications or policy of this type of analyzing the growth conundrum and growth puzzles in Latin America. First of all, what this type of analysis shows is that you export or stagnate. You have to find Latin American countries that want to grow have to, some way or another, find a place in the world, have to integrate in a healthy manner with the world. Now, of course, you can integrate in a very poor manner. If you have an enclave like the mine in Potosí in the colonial periods, that was not a good way to integrate into the world. It was not good for the economy to have just this enclave of silver production. No? So health integration, good integration, means a robust development of your exportables and your importables, services and goods. And so a growth strategy for countries in Latin America, particularly for those that are not huge like Brazil, I think unavoidably has to take into account the idea of developing your tradable sector and integrating yourself with the world in a much more, finding your place in the world. And that creates a special role for the state, for public policy, because public policy can do some important actions to facilitate that integration, healthy integration. Second, you want a commercial policy, including a real exchange rate that is not an enemy of diversification. You want to create an environment where firms in your country can find it not too complicated to diversify and discover new niches, open new markets, innovate better, learn more, etc. So the commercial policy to facilitate a broadening of export destinations and a diversification of export products. Even if you have to start with commodities, you can still work around the margins and produce new things. Second, you have to have complementary reforms to support this outward orientation, and those complementary reforms will have to pay special attention to skills and education, therefore, a skilled labor force that has the right ability to join the labor market that would be needed to support that type of outward orientation, greater entrepreneurship, more innovation, better financial services, and markets that work better at allocating scarce factors. And finally, and this is an important message, now firms can locate wherever they want because of the internet, the flatter world, whatever. So they are going to go in countries where the conditions, the quality of life is better. So clean air is important. Good internet matters. That your streets are safe and that you can sit in the corner of the street in a nice coffee shop and drink a coffee. Your cultural attractions, the artisanries, the natural assets, all of them become important because in the world of today, if you want to prosper economically and you grow, you not only have to be a country that attracts capital, but also a country that attracts people. And that puts a high premium on your social equity agenda, because you won't attract many people if you have a highly divided country with a lot of social fractures, nor will you attract a lot of people to your country if you have problems with the rule of law. So the institutional improvements and the social agenda become an integral part of a growth agenda if you take this analysis seriously, which of course I do since I wrote this paper. So let me finish here and then open it up for questions.
All right, thank you. We have one question in the chat box. It's a long one, a couple combined. Can do you see it, Augusto?
Yeah, I can see it from Susan, no?
Yeah. And hopefully some others will type in also any questions they have. Oh, we do have another one. Great. Okay.
So this first question has to do with a dimension of development that's crucial, which is environmental sustainability. And I think this is, of course, a dimension that's becoming more and more important given climate change and all of these issues. So yeah, I think the future of the growth agenda cannot ignore sustainability. And that creates a special challenge for the commodity exporters. Ecuador, for instance, for a while, it still has to depend on oil. And oil is bad for the environment. It is a fossil fuel. It's not good for climate change. So there is a tension there. And the trade-offs are going to be more strongly felt in the future when you try to find a growth path that is clean. I think it's not impossible to do, even responsible mining can be done in an environmentally friendly way, but you have to pay a lot of emphasis on that, and I think that's unavoidable. And it is pouring into politics. much of the divisions in politics currently in my country, in Ecuador, have to do with different views about the environment and whether extractive industries should be given a free hand or whether you should put some controls on that to protect Mother Nature. So, so that's what I can say about that. Not a full answer, but somewhat of an attempt.
We have a cup. I just pasted one from someone in, and then Bill Messina has one after that.
Or one about Cuba. No, I see one on Cuba. How does Cuba fit in this analysis? Well, it's very hard to fit Cuba in this analysis because we know very little about Cuba. Cuban statistics are not part of the international financial statistics of the IMF. They don't appear in the World Development Indicators of the World Bank. So it is hard to get a read of Cuba. I visited Cuba several times while I was at the World Bank and had very interesting conversations. And my impression there is that Cuba is still trapped in a very asphyxiating, excessively planned, excessively dirigist type of economy. It's opening up only at the margins. If you open your own restaurant or maybe your beauty shop, you can have a little bit of a self-supporting single individual enterprise, but then you won't be able to import a hair blower, the thing to dry your hair that beauty shops need. So it's a mess to have a business when you cannot import your inputs. And you have a big problem in Cuba with a very distorted macro system because you have this dual exchange rate regime. So Cuba is going to need a lot of help from the world. And that's the unfortunate thing. Cuba has had to live on the defensive. If the US would change their views and would say, okay, we're going to support a modernization of Cuba and we're going to pour kind of a mini Marshall Plan in support of that, then Cuba can find a path. But if Cuba is left to its own, it will be very traumatic for Cuba to step out of the current system. Although the Cubans know that they need to do that, it's so painful to do it, and it would be so disruptive to do it without a lot of support from the outside that I am afraid that Cuba will stay in this cocoon in a defensive position with very low standard of living until the world becomes more intelligent and accepts that what Cuba needs is not an embargo. What Cuba needs is support of the international community so that it can find a better place in the world.
Okay, we got a lot of questions coming through here, but can you scroll back up? There's one at the very top. I hate for this person's question to get ignored. On your slides 18 to 19, what kind of commodities are fluctuating so much? It's above Bill's Cuba question.
Yeah.
And then there's more down below.
Well, the commodities price that I calculated for this presentation is the average of all commodities. And so what you have is a basket, depending on the country, a basket of industrial metals, which essentially is what characterizes Peru and Chile. Both export copper and iron and industrial metals. Then in the case of Colombia and Ecuador, you have oil exporters. And so oil figures prominently in that basket. But Colombia and Ecuador have other commodities. Ecuador does banana and cocoa and coffee and shrimp. And Ecuador is beginning to process those goods. So they are no longer raw commodities. They are becoming more kind of semi-manufacturing goods. And then you have the agricultural commodity exporters that are in the South Cone. Meat exporters like Uruguay and Argentina, soy exporters, which are includes also Brazil. So for South America, the commodity prices that you saw are essentially the average of the prices of the main 16 commodities that Latin America exports, which are a basket of agricultural commodities, minerals, and oil.
So after Bill's, we have one from one of the students, from Miguel Leche. How has education? Yeah, no,
education clearly has improved in Latin America. The number of years of education, the average number of years of education in the labor force has risen very significantly since the 90s in Latin America until the present. The quality of education is still a question. It's very difficult to measure the quality of education. And the translation of education into skills is also very difficult to test. And one can say that we still have a lot of mismatches in Latin America. We still have too many lawyers, an insufficient number of doctors and engineers. So we still have problems with the quality of the labor force despite an improvement in education. And Latin America still has a very serious deficiency in public education, and that is a source of inequality. So if you go to South Korea, public education is great. No South Korean parent would think about sending the kid to a private school because the public schools are so good. The teachers are of excellent quality. The top of the population, the most brilliant South Koreans choose to be teachers. And so the quality of the education system is light years ahead of that of Latin America. That said, Latin America has been making some improvements, but it's behind. And there's no growth, a bright future for the growth agenda in Latin America that does not include a major upgrading of human capital through education, including starting with early childhood education and ending with technical careers and universities.
Okay, so we got from Carmen Diana.
Yeah, I'm looking at this.
You've got a few economists on here, Augusto, so.
Yeah, no, growth is a mystery. And I think we economists have become much more modest. We don't have the clue, as to what really gets growth going. It's that seems to be fairly idiosyncratic. And in the 90s, when I was doing policy, we were all optimistic, thinking that once we controlled inflation and got the macro right in Latin America, we would start growing, and it didn't happen. We got the macro right, we stabilized, and we didn't grow. So there are many other drivers of growth that should be behind. So part of the reason for this paper is try to add some light. Much of what I have seen about growth in Latin America relies on solo approaches. Look at productivity and you get depressed because productivity in Latin America is way below the frontier. And then people try to run regressions to see why the productivity is so low, and you always get the same answers. It's because education is poorly, and the markets don't work well, and the business environment, and the rule of law. So you get that same type of things. But this analysis at least shows that there's something to be said about adding to that analysis the fact that growth in Latin America will not happen, in my mind, unless Latin America finds a place in the world. And that means trade and trade integration, and do it smartly and doing it well. And Latin America has not so far globalized well compared to, say, Southeast Asia. So that I see for the future. Now, integrating yourself into the world requires a lot of dimensions. Now, if you have to rely on your commodities, if that's what you do now, that's you don't look at the horse in the teeth. It's just, that's a gift of nature. But then you have to find ways of getting the space for entrepreneurs to discover new niches. And you see that happening to some extent. In Ecuador, I see that all of the coffee growers have gone into café de altura, high altitude coffee, higher quality. They are going into the upper end of the market, which commands better prices. That requires innovations in Ecuador in the way you produce it, organically produced, environmentally produced, etc. So adaptations go on, but we are going to have to do much more in public policy in Latin America to allow these processes to happen and to allow for big investments. We need a wave of investments in tradable industries, be them goods or services. And that is not going to happen unless public policy makes a huge effort to create the conditions for that to happen and to work more cooperatively with the private sector in helping move the obstacles away. to get into that. Yeah, if you ask me about Ecuador in particular, I see a lot of prospects. If we get the rule of law a little improved, I see a lot of prospects in the tourism industry. We have wonderful natural assets, including the Galapagos. In the wellness industry, we have some very beautiful cities with good food and nice music and friendly people. So all of the retirees from the US are welcome to come and stay there. They will get good medical services, good food, good cook, nice air. So wellness industry, welcoming the retirees can be another big area. In the area of, I see a lot of potential in Ecuador in the area of agricultural, agro-industry, in coffee, chocolates, cocoa, processed fish, etc. So each country is going to have to find its place, right? And I don't have a generic formula. At the end of the paper, what we say is, each country has to find how to start pulling the right strings to get growth going. And once growth gets going and people become more enthusiastic and the future looks better, then you can get a virtuous circle where that can be sustained. And then if you look at the next question is, could you ever turn around Venezuela? Well, unfortunately, Venezuela has fallen trapped to the worst kind of arrangement, right? Because now you have a government that also has the power of the arms, the armed forces. So the government keeps on making mistakes and running the economy to the ground and impoverishing people. People are unhappy, but there's no way for them to express their views because they can be repressed. And the government has the armed forces around there. So you have blunted democratic solutions in Venezuela. I have the feeling that Venezuela will need a lot of friendly governments from Latin America and other parts of the world to help to push the regime to open up, go back to basic freedoms, and find a path to recover the lost ground. It's such a sad story, Venezuela, but it's an example of collapse, of a country that was rich. 1970 was the richest country in Latin America that now is poorer than Ecuador and Bolivia and Paraguay.
If we, Augusto, if you can skip down to Domingo's question that continues on Venezuela, and then maybe Pilar's is the last question as we're kind of closing. You see Domingo Jimenez down there at the bottom.
Yeah, Venezuela always had that excessive dependence on oil. Oil was almost the only game in town in Venezuela. And so Venezuela was already tempting the curse. But it had some things that kept it going. It had, for instance, PDVSA, which was the oil company in Venezuela. Until the time before Chavez came, PDVSA was a very well-run enterprise. And even the politicians thought that was an asset. We're not going to monkey around with that asset because that's what's creating the income for the country. So PDVSA was kept as a fairly professional, independent, well-run oil company. And that was the main source of income for Venezuela. But Venezuela was always too much in the rentier society. It lived and died with oil. And now all that has become excessive. Now there's nothing else but oil, and the rents from oil are the thing that keeps the system going. Every other aspect of the economy has been destroyed. Venezuela exports the little oil it can produce, and it's not producing much because it has become very inefficient in oil production and extraction. So it exports that and it buys everything else. And there's shortages of every sort of things. And Venezuela is now under the curse of hyperinflation. So the economic destruction in that country is horrible. And as a result of that, you have this huge migration of Venezuelans going to other countries, which again creates big social tensions. Venezuela sat for too long in the reliance on commodities. It exacerbated that reliance too much. It was always tempting the curse. And once you have a rentier society, your institutions get tainted. And then you had this failure of the elites to deal with these problems. And all of a sudden, Venezuela got trapped into the most horrible type of populism, authoritarian populism that now is a tyranny. And I just don't see how you get out of that without a big international support and endeavor.
Okay, thanks. We got two last questions from Pilar. One was above Domingo, and then she's got another one, two long ones.
Yeah, so this is Pilar is going back to this debate that I have been involved in, which is, this import substitution industrialization, did it plant the seeds of its own demise, or was it an essentially viable enterprise that, given more time, could have made a transition towards more of an Asia type experience? I think the burden of the proof is in that view. I can give you several arguments why the model itself, the inward-looking industrialization, focused on your local market with high protection, was unsustainable. And if anything is unsustainable, sooner or later it will die. And why was it unsustainable? First of all, because it promoted a type of production that was very inefficient, because that production only survived thanks to the high protection. Ecuador, for instance, in the 1970s, used to assemble cars. They were awful cars. They were these Andino cars. Ecuadorians were forced to buy these Andino cars because it was prohibitive to import a car from outside. But that car was a mess. It was too expensive and it was bad quality. It would not last for too long. The moment Ecuador had to compete with international markets, that car had to die. Every Ecuadorian was happy that now we can buy a Japanese car instead of that one. So I think ISI went too far in supporting inefficiency. Once it protected inefficiency, it created a class of industrialists that were that sat in their chairs and waited for rents to happen. They didn't have to innovate too much. They had the protection. They could sell to a captive market. So this protection of inefficiency made the system unsustainable. Then, since you were closed and you had to keep spending going for the production to keep on going, and production was not very efficient, ISI, import substitution industrialization, had an inflationary bias. And you can see in the data that in the 70s already inflation was going up in Latin America, and it was probably the dynamics of import substitution industrialization. And then the third argument I can give you is that system of import substitution industrialization was thirsty of imports. Whatever goods you produce, whatever manufacturers you produce, had to be produced on the basis of imported inputs, imported intermediate inputs, imported capital goods. So you needed foreign exchange to import those things. As long as you had commodities, you could have enough foreign exchange to keep the import substitution industrialization model going. But once your commodity prices weakened, you had a problem. And so what policymakers used to do, and I see this in my country very, very clearly, is that the moment they could no longer sustain the model because they didn't have enough foreign exchange, they would go into borrowing binges. So you see many import substitution industrialization type countries in the late 70s started borrowing like hell to try to sustain something that was unsustainable. But that worsened things because it ended up with over borrowing and the debt crisis. So my sense is that import substitution industrialization was ill-conceived from the beginning, and it had its inherent contradictions and was in itself not sustainable. But that's my view. If you ask my dear friend Jose Antonio Campos, he will tell you a different view. And I respect that view, and we will continue to debate on this. But I think I can offer a lot of evidence that makes a case that import substitution industrialization was unsustainable. And in that sense, it was a dead end. But the other view is no, that was the golden age of Latin America. Well, between golden age and dead end, you can take your views, but I think the arguments militate in favor of thinking that the model itself was wrong, that looking inward was not the right move for Latin America, and it lost the train. Latin America lost the train to growth by looking inward in the 1960s and 70s.
Okay, I don't know if you covered all the points in her two questions.
Let me see if there's more there.
Because yeah, we're at 5 minutes. So we got a few minutes to close things up.
Many of the statements she makes are in full in agreement. For instance, there's one that says it was not import substitution industrialization what hurt Latin America. It was the comfort of being protected for too long. Yes, but being protected for too long was a derivative, a corollary of import substitution industrialization.
But import substitution industrialization had a component of, when you talk about exports and trade, you think of competing in markets. But when your institutions and your core structure, your markets are not working well, you cannot compete externally. So you need to fix that first. And in my mind, it was kind of a temporary protection would have been good, where you want to strengthen an industry or strengthen a market or a set of markets, and then start going open up and competing.
No, I grant you that intellectual justification was infant industry protection, temporary protection for infant industry. But there was no test of efficiency. Consider, for instance, South Korea. South Korea had a huge government support, huge government intervention. The role of the government in South Korea was as active or as proactive as the one in the governments in Latin America. But the governments in South Korea were saying, okay, I will help you and I will give you some support as long as you succeed in the export markets. That was the test.
In the long run.
If you have the test, it's difficult to assess whether you are supporting for too long. You don't have the test of competition. And for me, that was kind of inherent to import substitution, although one has to recognize that many great economists at CEPAL in the late 70s were already critical of their own model, saying we have gone too far. We're protecting for too long. We need to start looking at exporting, etc. So there was internal criticism within import substitution industrialization. But yeah, you can always have an infant industry argument and debate as to whether the infant industry argument can take you far enough. So those are valid points. And I'm not going to say that there's only one way to look at things, but I still believe that the stronger case and evidence is that it was a wrong turn. It would have been better for Latin America to do more of like an Asia style thing. Let's look outward. Let's develop exports that can be sold in competitive international markets. We will support companies and institutions until we can achieve that. We will do that, but at least we will have a test of being able to survive in competitive international markets.
One question would be whether Southeast Asia actually had a period of looking inward.
Not much. We see that one reason why they didn't have a chance to look inward, and this is part of the I don't know, the important difference, is that Southeast Asia did not have commodities. So that Southeast Asia could not do an import substitution model, even if it wanted, because an import substitution model requires to have foreign exchange to support the imports of intermediate and capital goods you need to support your local manufacturer. So Latin America could think of that model because it could use commodities to generate a foreign exchange to support that model. Southeast Asia did not have commodities. So even if they would have wanted to do import substitution, they couldn't, because they didn't have the foreign exchange to support that. So from the beginning, they had to think of a model that by itself would generate foreign exchange. So from the beginning, they went outward-looking exports. So that's an interesting contrast. In some sense, we were the mirage. We had foreign exchange. With foreign exchange, we can do this little trick. That is part of the reason why Latin America was able to choose import substitution. whereas Southeast Asia could not go that route because it didn't have foreign exchange to support import substitution. It had to think of a growth model that would generate endogenously by itself foreign exchange.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for their questions. There's a couple comments, but it's exactly 8 o'clock, so I don't want to hold people any longer, even though I'm glad that we got some good questions. And a little bit of discussion with our attending economists.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment about similarities between Latin America and Africa. That's I think a good theme for research.
Yeah, thanks Renata for coming. She's at our Center for African Studies upstairs. All right. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks for the students that are still here hanging on, some that are left. And thanks so much to Augusto. I think it was a good presentation and some good questions at the end. So thanks to everybody and enjoy this lovely Florida evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Augusto, so much for your excellent presentation. And we continue this conversation hopefully soon again. Thanks so much.
Yes, we'll do that. Thank you very much.